This is going to be a quick showcase of a new build I've discovered recently, and I want to talk about it because it's not only interesting, but it's actually surprisingly effective, and because it stands out from other soldier builds that are maybe more weapon or assault rifle focused that are pretty, well, boring. I don't think you could come up with a more boring build than the assault rifle damage build. So this build works in contrary to most of those builds. So basically it's focused around primarily this team perk, which is cool customer. So there's a lot of weirdness about this ability. So it reads with Stay Frosty active, using an active ability reduces the cooldown of all abilities by 3 seconds and ends Stay Frosty. Well, the first question is, what is Stay Frosty? I think this is worth talking about because it's kind of a new class perk for Soldier, so not everyone is familiar with it. But Stay Frosty reads, after 3 eliminations, increased ranged weapon damage by 10% and weapon stability by 35% for 7 seconds. Additional eliminations refresh the duration. So what this perk doesn't tell you, it's just 3 eliminations, but from the limited testing that I've done, it seems to be ranged weapon eliminations only, meaning if you get a kill with an ability or a hover turret, basically only certain amount or only certain kills trigger this Stay Frosty ability. This ability also has a visual effect a lot of people weren't too familiar of. When it comes on, there's kind of this glare on your gun, and then this red crosshair sits in front of your gun, and this is harder to see on some guns. Um, so it's not clear. It's not super clear when it comes up. There doesn't appear to be a video or audio cue. So a lot of people don't really know what this is, but this is the Stay Frosty V effect, and this is what is required for this team perk to work correctly. So this build is basically centered around cool customer. So every perk we add to this build will fall into 2 main buckets. The first being things that allow you to use your cooldowns faster or use your abilities faster, and things that take advantage of using quick cooldowns. Right? So every perk we add will either do one of those 2 things. So the first is the commander ability. So I went with cluster bomb, which is frag grenades explodes into 6 small grenades, which each deal 50 base damage in a half tile radius. So why did I go with this? Well, basically the best way to capitalize on it is to buff grenades, because grenades are the ability that you can use the most during a match. So once we decide that, hey, we should buff grenades, we have to figure out then how do we buff grenades. So there's a couple of perks that buff grenades. There's things like making them cost cheaper and just straight up increasing their damage. So I went with Cluster Bomb because I feel Cluster Bomb hits a niche that the other buffs don't do. For example, simply making your frag AoE bigger is effective only when in large crowds, which isn't always the case. And the same goes for increasing the damage of frag grenades. If your frag grenades are going to one-hit kill most of what you throw them at, then increasing the damage is not as important. So the cluster bomb kind of hits the middle ground where it almost increases the range and also almost increases the damage just enough. And the cluster effect is particularly good against particular enemy types. So this would be like shielders or the riot husks or situations where normal grenades would kind of fail. Cluster bomb has a sneaky ability to be effective even against those particular types of enemies. So moving on to the support perks. Most of this is going to allow you to keep using abilities. I'm using eliminations restore 6 energy over 3 seconds. Duration refreshes with additional eliminations. This basically allows us to have enough energy to cast whenever we want to cast. And this works as an alternative to kind of individual support perks that would decrease the cost of them. This basically allows you to always have enough energy to use whatever abilities you want. We're going to go with leadership in our second one to decrease the war cry cooldown. Again, the whole point is to use abilities often, and this is a very clear way of using war cry more often. Next up, we have increasing the shockwave radius, and this is just the most effective way to buff shockwave. And grenade damage will just straight up give us a damage bonus. On this last perk, we're going to have increasing the radius. Again, we could have put any of these support perks in the commander perk, but I feel like cluster bomb is the most effective way to buff your grenades. In the gadget slots, we're going to have adrenaline rush and slow field. You might be thinking, why not hover turret or something that deals damage? Well, it's because again, you cannot get this Stay Frosty perk with those kills. So you basically always want to be killing enemies with either your weapon or your abilities, and not these gadgets. The gadgets will allow you to set up more kills or stay alive longer. The slow field's particularly good with all the AoE that you have from the cluster grenades and your modified shockwave. The ideal way to use this build is to attack with your weapon until you get 3 kills, use an ability to consume that, and then rinse and repeat. So it sort of works like a mage where you're only using your weapon enough to get those 3 kills, and then you immediately go into using an ability, and those abilities come up so quickly that you should be using your abilities, every 10 seconds or so, and kind of shooting is the secondary way of getting kills with this build. As far as weapons go, it's not super important. You basically want to use ranged weapons. That's kind of the only requirement for using this build effectively, because it triggers the Stay Frosty as well as the stacks of vulnerability as well as Warcry buffs. You basically want to use weapons that work well with Warcry, so something like large magazines, maybe a slow fire rate. The only real downside with this build is the kind of strict playstyle that you have to adhere to get the most out of it. That would be forcing you to get ranged weapon kills when you don't necessarily want to. So an example of this would be, say, if there's a smasher going by, typically you would want to melt him down, but if you need those 3 kills, maybe you kill the smaller husks instead. And the same thing goes for kind of finding small groups of enemies where you would typically want to throw a grenade, but in this case, you'll have to use your ranged weapon to kill those 3 guys instead of simply throwing a grenade. But it's just my humble attempt to make Soldier a little bit more interesting.